I bought Speck in August of 2020, and in my last video you saw a tour of Speck as we lived aboard her over the winter of 2020 to 2021. Here's the story of how she got south for the winter. Since she was hauled out for a survey anyway, we spent the weekend tackling projects which could only be tackled out of the water. Things like a new transducer, polishing the hull, refurbishing the prop, and I also had the yard install new bottom paint. After launch, we spent a good chunk of September in Maine before delivering back to Boston, and then fast forward to October when we're ready to get off the dock and sail south.
Beautiful day for departure.
It was a rainy Thursday evening, but you take whatever weather windows you can get in late October when we set off for an overnight sail for the Cape Cod Canal. The first leg we were running at pot watch, 20-minute rotations, stood on the bow, watching for pots to help the helm at night. Horrible carry-on altogether. But there was 5 of us on this leg, and that made for an easy watch rotation and plenty of sleep for everybody on board. After a wet and windy night, we made it to the Cape Cod Canal, where we stopped off at a mooring field to wait until first light before proceeding across Buzzards Bay. We were riding the tail end of a gale as we made our way from Buzzards Bay to Norfolk, Virginia, and in fact that previous night, when entering the canal, winds had picked up to 35 knots just before we tucked into the Cape Cod Canal for some protection. As the day progressed, the winds eased as forecast, and by sunset we were passing Block Island. The trip down to the Chesapeake continued uneventfully, other than an all-day offshore head surgery to unclog the head. Later on night 2, we were passing the lights of Atlantic City offshore, and then later the Delaware River. Things continued uneventful until pulling into the Chesapeake on night 4. I was fully intent on being awake as we entered the Chesapeake, but what I didn't realise is it would take hours and hours to get up the channel in the Chesapeake and into Norfolk. That meant I didn't sleep at all that night. Hi friend!
More friends! Yay!
We had a quick 4-day stop in Norfolk, Virginia, a city which far exceeded my expectations. We spent the week working from the boat. After a quick windlass install, it was time to take off again, headed south on the ICW. I passed through my first ever set of lock gates, and by the end of the first night, we were dropping the hook just at the mouth of the Albemarle Sound. The following morning it was up with the hook, and our goal was to make it to Belhaven. The boat was covered in mayflies, dead or dying from the night before, but it was out with the anchor washdown, and they didn't last long. After crossing the Albemarle Sound, it was into the Alligator River Canal. We even managed to caulk some of the decking seams on the way south. The Alligator River Pungo River Canal is dead straight for miles and miles and miles. But there are many shallow spots, so it does require a constant eye on the depth sounder. Speck's a deep boat, she draws 7'3", but we had no issues on this small section of the ICW that we traversed from Norfolk down to Beaufort, North Carolina. That night we dropped the hook in Belhaven since the marina was full. No harm, $70 saved. And so we dinghied ashore to Belhaven. Our instructions to get dinner that night involved turning left at the light, as in the traffic light, the only one in town. There's the light. We found the light! Belhaven looked like what we imagined small town America looked like growing up in Ireland. Goodbye Belhaven. Day 3, the last on the ICW, saw us briefly sailing across Pamlico Sound before motoring the rest of the way to Belhaven through the rain. By early evening we'd made it to Beaufort, which was a beautiful town on the North Carolina coast, right by the Outer Banks. This was a real gem of a place. We dropped the hook in Taylor Creek, right in the middle of town. And later that night some of the locals paid us a visit, the first of many on this trip. We also dinghied over to the little island behind the boat and met some of the wild horses. The following weekend, it was time to leave again, this time non-stop to Charleston, South Carolina. We had another escort of dolphins out the inlet before hoisting sails and heading south. We had conditions that were to be a recurring theme on this trip, about 20 knots from astern, with 5 to 8 foot seas that we were either surfing down or had on our beam. Shaun, who has tens of thousands of ocean miles under his belt, took the helm first, and right off the bat managed to hit 14 knots surfing down a wave. But before the day was out, most of us had accomplished the same feat. The wind vane was in frequent use on these early offshore trips, playing a blinder surfing down the big sea state. I've since heavily reinforced the attachment points to the autopilot, and it doesn't get as much use these days, I'm ashamed to admit. Now Speck's a great offshore boat, but she's more of a racer than a cruiser, and so some of these passages could get pretty wet in the days before having a dodger attached. And so we had made it to Charleston, South Carolina, where another week was spent working from the boat and exploring the city by night. By the end of the week, it was time for the last leg from Charleston, South Carolina to St. Augustine, Florida. More downwind surfing, more 20 knots true, more 5 to 8 foot seas. This leg of the trip was the shortest, and we flew 220 miles in 28 hours. And so here we are, coming through the Bridge of Lions to our winter destination of St. Augustine, Florida. Then there was the next adventure, how to bring a horse, trailer and pickup truck the same distance down the country
In 435 miles, take the exit on the right.
St. Augustine was a great spot to spend the winter. We had dolphins on the back porch, weird and wonderful wildlife, and glorious sunny weather for most of the duration of our stay. That Christmas, we had the bright idea to spend our 10 days off sailing to and back from the Bahamas. Off Cape Canaveral, we were paid a visit by a Coast Guard helicopter who wanted to make sure we weren't going to drift into the security zone because SpaceX were doing a bunch of launches that weekend. After 3 wet and difficult days offshore, we arrived into the Abacos, where it was cold and windy. We did have one warm sunny day, which we spent exploring the mangroves, seeing turtles and stingrays. But it turns out December is still very much the off-season in the Abacos, and we only had about 4 days before we had to turn around and do it all over again. This time with the Gulf Stream with us, rocketing us back to St. Augustine. And that 14 knots down a wave record, that's now 17 knots. Join me next time for the trip back north, including a 4.5-day, 575-mile single-handed trip from St. Augustine to Norfolk. Gur mille má gribh go léir as féin.